Okay, so I'm just going to mute everyone. There we go. So if we open up with Gregor, who's going to be presenting a paper which he's written with Christian, Levesque and Glenn Morgan and Nicolas Roby on disruption and re-regulation in work and employment from organizational to institutional experimentation. So I will hand over to Gregor. So Gregor, if you would like to unmute yourself and share your screen, that would be fabulous.
I didn't do the one thing. A lot of things disappear when you start mucking around with the screen. First, is the screen shared, Kazi?
Yes, the screen is shared. We can see your slides.
A whole bunch of them or just the main one?
A whole bunch of them. So I'm not sure if you need to...
Sorry about this.
It's all right. It's the
we're
of technical
on a learning curve here. I'm just trying to remember. Oh, let's try going down there. That should be
perfect.
Okay. And let me start, everyone, by introducing Cassandra Bowkett, who is a postdoctoral research at HEC Montreal, working with Christian Levesque and others there on the aerospace industry, and we'll hear more from her in 10.2. But she generously agreed to chair this session, so thanks very much, Kazi. Background, I think some of you know at least that we have this project on institutional experimentation for better work. What is it about? It's about disruptive change leading to the re-regulation of work and employment. It's the argument that this opens up space for experimentation at different levels, organizational, institutional, that it presents an opportunity for better work, but quite often it prevents a glorious opportunity for neoliberal worse work. And the question then becomes, how do you move towards one as opposed to the other? What kinds of situations, what kinds of collective capacity attributes are associated with movement towards better rather than worse? And of course, you might also want to define what makes better, what makes worse, but I'm not going to stop so much on that today. Now, the argument is that you have these fault lines of disruption, creating uncertainty, and the implications is that you're getting a reordering of sources of regulation at an organizational level. You know, you think about a union, you think about a company, you think about a fairly restrained arena. You're getting resilient responses to uncertainties. Social actors of all kinds are looking for options to regain control. And they sometimes mobilize new identities, promote new understandings, and then they reflect on, assess, learn, and modify the strategies on the basis of these experiments. And the question of institutional experimentation is whether these experiments are sustainable. Can they be scaled up? What facilitates or inhibits the experimentation? And how do social actors engage with these facilitators or enablers? And of course, the argument here and overall for these sessions in this symposium and beyond is that labor-centered researchers have a role here in working with actors to try and understand how you push things in a better direction or a worse direction. And I think the interesting thing about all of the presentations forthcoming in this session is that everyone fits in this way. So Janice and Hannah, that's exactly what they're doing. Sally and Ian, that's exactly what you're doing. Kazi and Christian, Matthew, Mayun, and myself, I hope I haven't forgotten anyone who is building this. And if I sent out a discussion note that there's also a special issue forthcoming with most of the text now online in transfer, making similar sets of arguments where you have Isabelle Ferraras, Julienne Charles, and Oriane Lamine talking about SMART in this way. You have Heather Connolly talking about the rejigging of a local union in the UK, where it wanted to move to 100% individualized contractual employment. Of course, it was a magnificent flop, but what was interesting was the way that the union sought to experiment with its repertoire to counter this. You have a piece from Gerhard Bosch and his colleague on future agreements relative to new technology, Industry 4 in Germany. There's another piece by Valeria Polignano and colleagues on service work. So the argument is that you need to build up this base of cases, and that's what we're seeking to do. Some of the fault lines, think of disruptive technology, think of climate crisis and transition, think of pandemic health threats, think of shifts, disconnects in identity, solidarities, and values. And of course, there we're talking about Black and Indigenous lives matter, financialization, the fissuring of the firm, the reconfiguration of global production networks, the redefinition of the role of the state, and big time in the context of pandemic, all of these disrupting modes of regulation. Now, the theoretical points of departure here is that a lot of the literature overestimates the coherence of neoliberalism and underestimates the crisis and uncertainty. The second is that you cannot underestimate actor resilience in this case. In other words, they're competing narratives, one that emphasizes coherence of neoliberalism, of actors being beaten down, and therefore tends to put structural power over agentic power as opposed to a competing interpretation. And admittedly, sometimes the glass is half full or it's half empty. Now, the argument is that these fault lines stimulate experimentation. Actors respond to disruptions of traditional predominant forms of regulation and the ensuing, it should read, uncertainty. And this is a challenge to their institutional legacies, the way they traditionally do things, their typical modes of action, their skill sets. In the context of uncertainty, actors move outside of traditional repertoires and strategies of action, often in combination with existing legacies. Sable and Kuznetsov have argued that the absence of ex-ante solutions stimulates rethinking of inside and outside of the box responses in new combinations. And this takes place at different levels, and it involves both organizational and institutional fields. And it can take different forms. It might be permanent, it might be temporary, it might be a total flop. And the key thing here, I think, is that actors are engaged in a reflective exercise of learning and developing new collective capabilities. And researchers, as I argued, have a role to play in these processes. And I think that it characterizes all the contributions that you're going to hear in this session 9.2 and 10.2. Now, if you want a very, very idealized, almost Pollyanna-ish view of experimentation, you've got one from the top, challenges and from real world change. Therefore, actors begin looking for new strategies, regulatory and recombinations to experiment. You look for resources to go with it. You try and implement. It's sometimes deliberate, it's sometimes emergent. And then you monitor, assess, reflect, and learn and modify these strategies on that basis. Now, I think that you can argue that there's a kind of neoliberal experimentation, marketization, outsourcing. Their first movers use disruption to develop new, more exploitive forms of work, less security and greater risk, less control, less voice. But we're arguing here that there's also hybrid experimentation, and this was what interests us, where you get new organizational institutional forms to mitigate neoliberal pressures to make work more secure, rewarding, meaningful, participative. And of course, we share that normative objectives. So the actors respond by this combination of old and new. They draw on existing organizational legacies, but they make new ones. There are new combinations. A famous scholar by the name of Fine talked about policy entrepreneurship and worker agency and how they're intertwined between different regulatory arenas in a bricolage of organizational forms. And that's exactly, in this sense, what we're talking about, this bricolage of old and new. So an example of organizational is you could have temporary agency work, or you could see a hybrid experiment where you're developing common platforms for bargaining and services. In a way, that's exactly what SMART does in Belgium, if you take a look at the piece by Julien Charles et al. In institutional, you can have self-employment status of gig workers, or you can use public procurement to require living wages, training, and voice. So you have different things going on here. Here's an example of looking at the interface between hybrid and experimentation, looking at the interface between organizational and institutional. And this is that what's your degree of actor autonomy? Is it high or is it low across the vertical axis, and across the horizontal axis on the top? Are the institutional constraints relatively light or relatively tight? And for example, in the bottom right-hand corner, low capability and tight institutional constraints really lead you to a repertoire of resistance. There's not a lot more you can do, and it's certainly difficult to scale up. Whereas high and loose allows existing institutions provide openings to enable organizational experimentation. So we're just playing along with these, the link between institutional enablers and constraints and the degree of actor capacity. Now, there's a strong impetus for organizational experimentation across the board, but uncertain outcomes. Institutions may enable or strain. It's messy, fluid, uneven, contested, and frequently subject to failure. In the paper that we're just publishing, we do a couple of examples. One is co-working as neoliberal individualization, or as the emergence of new forms of solidarity for the new freelance workforce, where there's a search for institutional arrangements for collective capabilities and actor agency in this new context. Is it we work as a neoliberal corporate firm, or is it the Barcelona, Bristol kind of model where you develop solidarity between this freelance workforce and they're gaining new collective capabilities and voice, which they didn't previously had? In a sense, SMART in Belgium is also about that. You can also think of the emergence of alternative union forms. For instance, UE Local 150's minority model in North Carolina, and how it runs up against regulative and institutional obstacles. But always it's dealing with uncertainty and it's trying to resolve a problem. Now, this requires meticulous analysis of how actors mobilize their resources and capabilities, their strategies to maintain and disrupt and transform organizations and institutions at different levels. And of course, you have to take into account all of these other cross-cutting variables. Now, some of the key themes, and this is my last slide, Kazi, is we did the work on the cases for the issue of transfer, and we found several cross-cutting themes. One is that the experimentation is inevitably about agency. It's the resilience of those experimenting, their identities, their resources, and how they might lead to these new collective capabilities or not. A second theme is deliberation, participation, and democracy are at the heart of experimentation. Now, you can say this is wishful thinking and we found what we want to find, but in a sense, what you see happening here is it's a key element if you're going to be engaged in this kind of experimentation. Experimentation is also both strategic and reflexive. It's a process of strategizing and learning from doing. There's also always issues of sustainability and scalability, and issues for organizational experimentation and coming to terms with institutional enablers or inhibitors. And it's not impossible either to think, well, you have an institutional change and then you want to follow down the line what's happening at an organizational level. And we take the example of the Quebec case of where they deregulated the length of collective agreement. So it used to be 3 years and then it could be any year. So if Patrice Gelette and Mélanie Laroche were here, they would be discussing how this translates into complex arrangements at local level about seniority, about rights, about what happens over the longer term when you make this institutional change. It opens up the space for experimentation, but that can be both worse work and better work. And as I made the argument, and I'll conclude with this, it's really about the need for systematic comparative research. Of course, we're thinking progressive, quote unquote. It's how to nurture the democratic nature of society by working with actors to reflect critically and constructively upon their actions and helping the public's capacity to solve its problems. And I think that through the contributions today and the other contributions that we're working on in the project, hopefully this can be seen as something that is achievable and can contribute to a broader thinking of making work better rather than work worse. Work worse. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Gregor. That was a really great start. To keep things running as quickly as possible, because I know we're pressed for time and I want to make sure the speakers have as much time as possible, I'm going to hand straight over to Ian and Sally. So Ian Greer and Sally Klingel are from Cornell University, presenting on the living wage in Tompkins County, New York, in the USA, an action research project. So I'll hand over to you, Ian. Thanks. So one of you needs to unmute, Ian or Sally. I don't know who's speaking.
That was me. Yeah, that's me. Okay, so I'm going to start and I'm going to give the context for this project, and then Ian's going to walk through the most recent research results coming out of the project. So let me just start with how this group, the Tompkins County Living Wage Working Group, came to be. Tompkins County is centrally isolated in upstate New York. We're a very small county, but Ithaca is the county seat, and it's also home to Cornell University and Ithaca College. We have about 100,000 residents, 62,000 workers. Our residents swell, of course, when the students are in town, but in terms of permanent residents. Tompkins County for a long time has had extremely low unemployment, including currently, but also low growth and a very high cost of living and extremely high income inequality. In New York State, we rank right at up near the top, and nationally, we actually have a high degree of income inequality. This project comes out of actually a 20-year living wage campaign started by the Tompkins County Workers Center. They began it in 1992, campaigning on behalf of paraprofessionals in the local school district, and a number of subsequent campaigns. Along the way, they did something unusual. They created something called a living wage certification process for employers using a locally calculated living wage. And right now, they have 126 living wage certified employers in the county. And that number goes up every year. It doesn't go down. So it's been increasing over the past 15 years. But as we all know, 3 or 4 years ago, the Fight for 15 campaign stimulated a lot of interest in living wages beyond just a place like Tompkins County. And in 2018, our governor legislated some minimum wage increases that would lead to $15 an hour, in some cases immediately. But he did it in selected industries and selected regions. We were actually left out of that legislation. So this gave rise to a new conversation about living wage at the county level, and whether or not we could actually have a county ordinance for a living wage. And the question was, would that help or hurt things? And so the Tompkins County Workers Center, along with a couple of county legislators, got together to say, what would a county living wage ordinance look like, and would it be a good thing or a bad thing for the county? So instead of commissioning some research on it, they decided to engage in a community dialogue project about this. And that's where our project sort of begins. So they established a working group to discuss the feasibility of this, spearheaded by, like I said, by the Tompkins County Workers Center, but including unions and community groups, elected officials, these 2 county legislators, but also town board supervisors, mayors, a couple of different types of employers and employer associations, including the Chamber of Commerce, very unusually, and researchers, and that was myself and Ian, and later undergrads that we brought into the process. So we've been meeting regularly since 2018 to look at the feasibility. Linked to the local credit union has been doing a calculation for the county for the past 15 years. So next slide, Ian, and I'll talk about the research approach we used. Okay, so we used a participatory action research approach for working with this group. And at its simplest, this is the idea of stakeholders working with researchers as opposed to researchers developing a topic and trying to get stakeholders to participate with them. Our particular flavor of participatory action research comes out of the pragmatic tradition, meaning the philosophy of pragmatism, John Dewey in particular, and has a set of practices associated with it. And I'll walk through just kind of basically what those practices look like, and we basically follow them. First, it's considered to be an open-ended organic process. It's not got a set start and end date because it's based on the needs presented in the local situation and what stakeholders define as the problems that they want to attack. The researcher role is as a friendly outsider who's engaging with stakeholders' problems rather than being an objective bystander, engaged with a separate agenda. And of course, there's lots of fuzziness in between those two poles. And so the researcher has a role to create an arena for dialogue among the stakeholders to, at all stages of the process, deciding what are the problems that are going to be addressed, how are we going to go about doing that, and what sort of action might come out of it. And the researcher supplies research methods along the way as appropriate. Sort of four basic principles in this sort of cycle of research that the participatory action research approach calls for. And the first is relevance, that the research is based in the needs of the stakeholders, and rigor, however, in terms of the methods that are used along the way, and opportunities for researchers and stakeholders to reflect together on what they're learning and what that means for action and how the process, the cycle begins again. So the first phase then in our engagement was, well, I should say this. I acted as the the facilitator for this working group. And so my focus was on creating the dialogue process and helping this group decide what was the relevant set of questions that they wanted to try to answer, what avenues of inquiry, and how to go about doing that. And then Ian worked to marshal the research methods and research processes with the group. So in the first phase, we really just had to decide on what was our primary question, area of inquiry. And the question that we settled on looks fairly obvious: is a county-wide living wage feasible? But it was not easy to get to that question. In fact, it took quite a while. There were a lot of concerns about agendas within the group. Were the employers, were the activists, trying to get employers to sign on to an agenda that they didn't necessarily agree with? Were the activists in the group were worried that the employers would force them to sort of give up their agency to engage independently in action related to living wage campaigns. So that took quite a while, but in the process of that dialogue, we were actually also working out our research agenda and our process. So the second phase was deciding on what data we needed and designing the research method, research process. And like I said, we did quite a bit of that in the course of the dialogue. We had sort of two things going on here. First was deciding or elucidating what we already knew in terms of baseline data about the county and about employment within the county, and what we knew from other localities about the impacts of the living wage. And then we moved into designing a research process to get information, engage in inquiry, and what we didn't know. And that was two basic categories of unknowns. One was what would be the effect of a living wage ordinance on various kinds of workers, and what would be the effect on the same on various types of employers. And you can imagine all the categories that go underneath that. So we began with an information gathering session, sets of sessions with employers. I'm not going to go into the process that we used for that, but we helped to design the process, and the entire working group helped to carry it out. So we engaged in that research together. And then we did the same with setting up a set of interviews with employers. And along the way, there was a lot of data gathering going on the known barriers that in the county to a living wage ordinance. One example of that is what's called the benefits cliff, where by increasing your wages to a certain level, you may actually lose social benefits that are keeping you afloat. And Ian did quite a bit of work actually on understanding what the benefits cliff was and how it's calculated and what that would mean for this project. So I'm going to stop there and let Ian go on with the process and results.
All right, thanks, Sally. I mean, this was really new to me, and I'm really glad that Sally was here to explain kind of our approach to doing this in the background. So, I mean, one thing that I had never really done before was give stakeholders a strong role in designing the research. So actually, they were involved not just in carrying out the research, but also helping us figure out how to get started. So we had a series of information gathering sessions, and the actual process was suggested by people, by some of the stakeholders. We asked very open-ended questions about kind of their concerns with the living wage proposal, which really was to have a cost of living adjustment in the minimum wage and to have that minimum wage go up really fast. And so we found these out. I don't really have much time. I'm not going to go into that. Let me say something interesting, though, or something I thought was interesting. So when you read academic literature and industrial relations journals about the effects of minimum wage increases, you hear a lot about job creation and job destruction effects. And this was not the central concern of people on the working group. And this is in part because we have such a well-performing economy in Ithaca. We have the lowest unemployment in New York State. Right now, it's quote unquote only 10%. So this was not what people were talking about. There were concerns that employers had. So we interviewed 40 of them. One thing we wanted to figure out, so they were wondering, well, how are we going to pay for it? And then there was also just a question: how much support is there for the living wage proposal? So we asked employers to cost it out, and we also just asked them what they thought about having living wage legislation. And unsurprisingly, there was a group of employers that said it's going to be expensive and we're against it. There was a much bigger group that said this is not going to cost us very much and we think it would be a good idea. More interestingly, I thought there was a group that said, well, this is going to be really expensive, but we should really do it. And here are some ideas for how we can have a big increase, raising up the bottom of our of the pay structure. Also interesting, I thought, was there was a group of employers that said, well, this is not going to cost us very much, but we're against it. And they had all kinds of interesting ideological, moral fairness arguments for this. And for me, okay, I also thought it was interesting that that large employers were more against it than small employers. I mean, for me, the kind of fascinating kind of qualitative research finding from this is that when you ask employers to cost out how much this is going to cost them, they start providing some calculations, but you quickly end up with questions of fairness and morality. The reason for this is that for most of the employers, the big cost is pay compression or addressing pay compression. So it's dealing with the problem that you have workers who are just above our living wage calculation who are going to be very angry and think it's very unfair if the bottom of the wage structure is brought up. So there are two main problems with this, according to employers. One is that they will have difficulty retaining people because the way you retain people is you maintain an advantage in terms of wages against your competitors on the labor market, other employers. So living wage employers especially had a real worry about this, that if the bottom is brought up, then it's harder to retain people using higher wages. There's also a concern with loss of morale. So if low wage workers don't have kind of a path towards quick pay increases, they will get angry and demotivated. So employers had a lot of ideas about how they could deal with this. One of them was to not address pay compression. This means a pay cut for owners and for managers and for top earners, or at least a wage freeze for them. Another is not to compress pay. So one employer said, let's raise everyone's pay by $4 an hour and reduce the workforce by 20%. And in between were all kinds of other ideas. So there's a lot of uncertainty that the working group talked about a lot, about how much addressing pay compression would cost. And I mean, for me, the bottom line is that the employers say, well, this is about dollars and cents. But when you actually talk with them about their cost calculations, you realize that there are kind of ideas about morality and fairness at the root of it. So yeah, I'm glad to be doing this and to be part of an attempt to experiment institutionally for better work. And I've learned a lot from Sally about the action research approach to doing that. So many thanks.
Okay, thank you both very much for that. I'm going to hand straight over to Janice, who is going to be presenting Divided Legacies, Understanding the Newly Emergent Municipal Labor Standards Enforcement Regime in the US. So go ahead, Janice.
Good morning, everyone. These are great presentations, and we've learned a lot from participating in this process. So I'll try to save us some time so that we have time for questions and go rather quickly. I'll say also that Hannah Shepard, my wonderful colleague in this book that we're writing together, is going to be helping with answering questions today. So the case of experimentation is implementation of local labor laws, establishment of municipal level labor enforcement agencies. And what started us on this project is that there's been all this amazing policy experimentation, in part because at the federal level, it's become so impossible for us to be able to change labor and employment laws, the Fair Labor Standards Act or the National Labor Relations Act. And so a lot of the action has moved to the state and local level. And we've seen a boom in state and local policy passage. And the black box has been about implementation and enforcement of these new policies. And in some cases, decision was made to, when you pass a law at the local level, you have to have some sort of enforcement power and agency to do it at the local level. And so in several cities, there have been quite extensive agencies created at the local level. So what we're interested in is why, is how enforcement practices and agency cultures vary. So you've got all of these agencies in blue cities, but the structures, the enforcement practices and agency cultures vary. And we want to understand what accounts for that variation. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to get this off of my, okay. So labor scholars and practitioners have developed a set of specific enforcement practices that serve as an ideal type of a form of enforcement, which we refer to as strategic enforcement. And we use this term in the Weberian sense, that it's a concept that represents a general phenomenon, though in this case, the proponents of strategic enforcement consider it to reflect better practices. So we look at how ideal typical strategic enforcement, as it's been theorized and put into practice at the federal level, fares when it's implemented in cities that have their own particular legal, political, resource, and organizational environments. And we want to understand what features of the local context impede or facilitate the translation of this ideal typical enforcement practice to the local level. So in terms of, just following the template, there were questions about the sources of disruption for the predominant form of regulation. And so just quickly, the decline of unions, the exclusion of certain workers and occupations from coverage, fissuring, subcontracting, and gig economy, tech, platforms, algorithms, anti-immigration crackdowns, and the decline of resources and the rise of the neoliberal state. I guess we see those as the primary sources of disruption. But I'll say also, one thing that I'm gonna talk a little bit more at the end about is, from our perspective, enforcement has been contested terrain from the very beginning. So in the United States, the very first minimum wage law was passed in 1912 in Massachusetts. But the price of its passage was that the legislature would only agree if the only enforcement was, quote unquote, through the court of public opinion. So from our perspective, enforcement and implementation is how these issues, minimum wage, paid sick and safe time, are re-litigated one way or another by actors. So the challenges of this disruption to traditional forms of regulation, it's harder to find employers who are buried in subcontracting arrangements and to hold them accountable. It's harder for workers to figure out who the target is. And by that, we mean the entity that has the power to give them what they want. It's harder to hold employers responsible up the chain. It's harder to collect back wages and fines and penalties. Fundamentally, it's gotten much harder for workers to complain and cooperate with agencies. They're much more loath to come forward, particularly because there's so little protection from retaliation. And it's much harder to achieve sector-wide compliance, right? We're not in a system anymore of where agreements can be extended to sectors, right? We're not in a system where collective bargaining sort of sets patterns in the private sector. Our methodology is comparing agency practices regarding enforcement of minimum wage standards and paid sick leave across 4 cities. San Francisco was really the agency that started all this in 2001. And we didn't get another really resourced local agency in 2015, but then we got 3, New York City, Seattle, and Los Angeles. So it's a comparative case study design that's drawing on qualitative, administrative, and archival data. Just to give you a flavor of what we're looking at the extent and the nature of educational outreach to employers and workers. We're looking at methods for identifying violations. Strategic enforcement argues that complaint-based enforcement alone is inadequate because complaint-based enforcement assumes that workers will come forward, and we now know that workers don't always come forward, and so we know that there's often a mismatch between violations and complaints and underlying rates of violations. So we know that in certain sectors we've got low complaints, but very high rates of violations. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Organizational practices, once potential violations have been identified, what the consequences for violations are, procedures for confidentiality and protection against retaliation, how agencies communicate and interact with employers, with unions and worker centers, legal nonprofits, and other community organizations, and the extent of formalization and consistency of these practices. So those are the outcome variables of interest. The actors, mayors and their key staff, city councils, councilors and their staff, council committees, city attorneys, other city and state agencies, The parent agency in which the enforcement agencies are nested really matters enormously, we're finding in our research. But for example, the Seattle agency initially sat in the Office of Civil Rights. The New York City agency sits within the Department of Consumer Affairs. The LA agency sits between the Bureau of Contract Administration. Civil service rules are very, very important. Rules that condition hiring, that condition compensation, the role of unions and worker centers and legal nonprofits, and then employers and employer associations. In terms of the time frame, T0 is before the establishment of the local offices, when enforcement was carried out by state and federal agencies. And even when these policies, these local policies, paid sick and safe time and higher minimum wage, were passed, there were not agencies that were established that were really systematically carrying them out. T1 is from the beginning of the agency establishment to the present. And T2 for us will be process outcomes. In our view, because these agencies are somewhat new, we'll be really looking at a set of process outcomes, and I'll share those with you now. How am I doing on time, Cassie?
You have at least 4 minutes left.
At least 4 minutes. I'm a rich woman. So the intermediate the process outcomes for us, they'll be first, methods for identifying violations. So as I said earlier, moving from a complaint-based reporting system is the essence of strategic enforcement, is a move to strategic or targeted enforcement practices. And there are various ways that we'll measure that. I'm happy to get into that with you in the Q&A. Organizational practices, once potential violations have been identified, and these range from intake to complaint and triage processes, so that not every complaint is treated the same, or a violation that's identified is treated the same. They're triaged on the basis of how many workers are involved, whether the workers are still employed, whether there's an understanding that this is an indication of a deeper problem in the labor market or in the industry. The use of prejudgment enforcement tools like prejudgment liens, how investigations are conducted and evidence is collected, how work is distributed among investigators, and the use of negotiations. The consequences of violations, the use of negotiations, the content of settlement agreements, fines, criminal penalties, treble damages, being able to take away licenses, set liens, and procedures for confidentiality and protection against retaliation. And then the other is the nature of communication with employers, unions, and worker centers. Even that is something that's very, very contested, right? Where in the old days, agencies and still are very opposed to communicating with, to sharing information with organizations. So key conflicts. So far, key conflicts that have cropped up have been over whether there's going to be a dedicated revenue stream for these agencies, whether there's going to be small business exemptions or exemptions for nonprofit organizations, targeting of specific sectors, directed investigations, co-enforcement, whether there'll be contracts with worker centers, community organizing groups, and legal nonprofits to support the implementation and the enforcement, whether there'll be a soft launch of new policies or whether they'll go right to citing employers, between city attorneys and agencies about whether they take cases, whether investigators will share information with organizations, and naming and shaming, which means that whether the mayors allow for these agencies to actually name companies when they are fined. So that's sort of what we're doing. That's what our project is about. And I'll just say a little bit about, we really got a lot out of using the template for thinking about this. Just a few suggestions or reflections. One is we think that it's really important, and what we do in our work is we really try to think about the motives and the preferences of actors, and explicitly draw that out of our data. We try to think about the strategies, including the alliances that they form that flow from those preferences. We try to really get specific about forms of power, and in this case, forms of employer power. And we use the structural and instrumental forms of power and try to think about that more. And we think that what's really, two final points, how important it is to think about the history over the longue durée. We're really using this book project as an opportunity to really dig in on how labor standards enforcement has evolved from the beginning in the US. And certainly we're using comparative literature as well. We've benefited a lot from the work of Eric Tucker and Levesque and others in Canada, for example. And then the other is looking at how the installed base of regulations that already exist in an agency condition what's possible, condition what happens in the present moment. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janice. That was a really interesting presentation there. And thank you for being under time. So I'll hand straight over for questions. I know we've got a queue of questions in the chat. If anyone has any other questions that they want to ask and they don't want to raise them in the chat, please use the raise your hand function. I can see that on my screen. So I'll go straight to, I'll do one question per person running through in the order of the chat to give everyone a chance to answer, and then go circle around again. So the first question was for Gregor from Benjamin Kreider. Or anyone, he's put here, can someone please talk more about the common platforms for bargaining that was just mentioned on one of Gregor's slides? So I'll pass that on to Gregor to have a think about. Kelly Pike has asked Gregor as well, how far do you think this extends? North American, Western, global supply chains context. It seems virtually impossible in the last case, and there's increasing evidence that violations equal greater productivity and profitability. I wonder about what lessons are here for there. And then we've got questions for Ian and Sally, again from Benjamin Kreider and Kelly Pike. We've got a little look here. If a business, Ben's asked if a business is living wage certified, is there a COLA built in? I hope you know what that is. I'm not entirely sure. And Kelly's asked Ian and Sally, the issue of manager feedback on workers' perception of fairness. What do stakeholders think about getting feedback from those workers about what they actually want? And about what about a campaign that clarifies the issue of whether fairness of unequal pay is worth the price of poverty wages? And finally, we have a question from Janice from Peter Fugel. What is your sense of how independent these municipal enforcement officers are of mayors or legislative leaders? Do you see significant shifts in process outcomes with changes in political leadership? Oh, sorry. Then if I hand over then to Gregor, then Ian and Sally, and then Janice, and I know, Janice, you mentioned your co-author was going to answer the questions.
Hannah Shepherd.
So,
yeah.
So you guys want to take it away? Gregor, do you want to start us off?
Great. I shall try and be quick to interesting questions that deserve much more elaboration. For Ben on the common platforms, I think it was a fairly loose usage that I was doing, and we have many specialists here on bargaining platforms and efforts to reintroduce commonality of the kinds that used to exist in pattern bargaining. I was referring specifically here to often workers whose contracts have been individualized. And I was thinking of the case of Esmart in Belgium. So I refer again back to this piece by Julien Charles, Isabelle Ferraris, and Oriane Lamine in the forthcoming issue of Transfer, where basically what happens with Esmart is you as an individual don't sign the contract, you hand it over to the cooperative who introduces common contracts across the way, and they have a legal team that does this. So, I mean, there are still power issues, but you've gained a collective capability by having this ability to say, well, we don't sign contracts that don't do this, 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 and this. And they've gained public legitimacy as well, and integration into the social security system. So a whole range of things which take you a long way from individualized gig work towards a common platform, which is negotiated and renegotiated. So it is a common platform in this sense, with common services as well. On Kelly, question on supply chains. Well, it's huge, but I mean, really, you're the specialist on supply chains, and in particular, this question of where is it better and where is it worse and why? And the case I'm most familiar with is an interesting one, which is in process in Vietnam, where they're redoing the labor law as a result of international trade agreements and introducing the possibility of having independent worker organizations at grassroots level, at no other level, but at grassroots level. So here you've got a case of an institutional change, which is facilitating something which might happen at organizational level. And there's going to be a lot of experimentation around this. Already there's a lot of experimentation because they have to kind of step up to the mark in terms of they're signing ILO conventions. 87 is signed, 98 is going to be signed, or 98 is signed, 87 is going to be signed. So you can see that these are big institutional changes because of geopolitical commercial reasons, which open up a space for experimentation. What's going to happen is a different issue, and we need to talk about that in more detail.
Thank you very much, Gregor. Just a quick update, Ben's advised that his COLA question was addressed, so can be ignored. He's got another question there for Ian and Sally. Is there any union involvement in the Tompkins County Working Group? Why or why not?
So I'll start with that one. Yes, there is. I should say that the Tompkins County Workers Center has union involvement and has from the start. They operate as sort of a community union in many ways because we have such small unionization in the county, and so they work with a couple different unions. The union that chose to participate in the working group was CSEA, and this is Civil Service Employees Association. They have the most members who are not currently receiving a living wage, so they were very interested. A lot of the trade unions, their members are already way above the living wage, so they've been participating in the working group. I'll move on just to answer part of Kelly's question, and then Ian can pick it up. Ian will talk about this issue of whether employers were right about what their workers think in terms of perceptions of fairness, because we did gather data on that. And but the second part of this, of whether this is exactly the question I've been asking Kelly about, whether this means that any sort of campaign going forward really should be focused more on a moral question rather than trying to convince people of job destruction or economic growth. And yes, clearly this shows that the campaign that the Workers Center has been engaged in for 20 years, which was asking exactly the question of residents that Kelly asked here about whether fairness of unequal pay is worth the price of poverty wages, was one, a successful campaign, and is exactly what seems to be likely to be the campaign going forward, based on the research that was just done. Ian, you want to talk about employer and worker perceptions?
Yeah, I mean, so so we had this idea that we would do a survey, and actually there's been, I think it's been surveying workers has been low priority because everyone assumes that workers want a living wage. But then employers tell us actually employers don't like it because they think inequality is more fair. So I guess we have to do a survey. I want to just mention that Janice's work has made me really think about how we would enforce this, because our Workers Center assumes that, well, they believe that wage theft is rampant in Ithaca. So I typed in this question, is there any evidence on how you enforce these things in small places like Ithaca, where, I mean, our enforcement capacity for, you know, any labor standard is really, really limited.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll hand over to Janice and Hannah. You've got the question I asked, I've read out. There's another question in the chat there from Christopher Tilley. asking about Stephanie Luce's second living wage book argued that communities where the fight for a living wage was harder ended up with more robust enforcement, whereas the easy wins were more likely to be dead letters. Do you have findings about the relationship of the nature of the campaign and struggles to the enforcement outcomes? So that's a third question for you both as well. So
I'm going to start and Janice will supplement. I'll start with the question about the relationship between mayors and the enforcement offices. And I think because most of these offices are new, we don't have sort of a array of kinds of political transitions. We have sort of anecdotes. I think what is obvious is that the sort of mayor and the orientation of the mayor at the time of the agency founding is incredibly important, and has these sort of long-lasting impacts, both in Seattle, the mayor set up a task force that included labor and work organizations, but also employers, and that was really essential for sort of the laying the groundwork of the agency. And there's examples like that in every city. What we have seen more of in terms of transitions, political transitions, is the head of the parent agency changing, and that also whoever that person is incredibly important also for kind of setting the ethos of what happens in terms of sort of how much bandwidth or how much leeway the people on the ground are given for kind of being creative about how they do enforcement and how they interpret the laws. Janice, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, okay. So the other thing just to say is that what we see over and over again is that the dynamic is city councils are activists and they pass these laws, but then mayors are in charge of implementation because they get to assign the administrators of these agencies, and then the administrators are the ones that make the rules. But the mayors have the purse strings and the mayors oversee this stuff. And part of what we've found is that the mayors are much more focused on better business climate arguments. So in some ways we argue this is kind of the structural power of business, right? To continue to condition in the mayor's mind how far they're willing to see enforcement taken, whereas city councilors in general are less sort of where you find like the really strong advocates for this. We have seen turnover, as Hannah says, in 3 of our 4 cities. The original directors of these agencies have turned over, and in some cases that was connected to mayoral turnover. So yeah. And yeah, in process outcomes, yes. For example, the second leader in Seattle was able to achieve much more around getting the mayor more comfortable with some harder things like naming and shaming. In San Francisco, again, the second director has been able to sort of move the mayor in a way that the first, who was terrific, still sort of faced some problems with. Hannah, you want to do the second question?
Yeah, so that's Chris Tilley's question about sort of the living wage and easy wins. And I think what's interesting about this case, in contrast to Luce's work, is that all of the advocates in this case fought very hard for the enforcement body. So there's a lot of it's kind of a different era, right, of acknowledgement of the importance of the enforcement body itself. So we don't quite have the contrast that we to be able to answer that.
And then just to conclude on Ian's question, Ian, what I would say is that what we see in other cities, not so much these 4, there are lots of small cities that have had laws passed and that are struggling with enforcement. And I've done a lot of surveys of those smaller places. And what they've tried to do is embed almost like fire alarms in the system for workers and for organizations to both identify the violations and then to act on them. And I'd be happy to share more with you about what some of those systems look like. I have to say, I'm kind of concerned about them. So it's not like I would say, oh yeah, do what these various small cities have done, but I'm happy to talk to you about it.
Okay, well, that takes us very nicely to 12:15. Thank you so much to all of the speakers, all of the participants, everyone who's been asking questions and watching and participating. And I'm going to wrap this up. Gregor, is there anything you want to say in sort of conclusion to wrap up the first?
Well, just to thank everyone and to remind anyone who's interested that this follows through with Experimentation 2, which is a different set of presentations papers, again, around the cases of experimentation with Cassie here and Matthew Dupuis and Miyun Wu and Ian and Matthew. So we can look forward to that at 12:30, chaired by Rose Batt. So thank you all, and sorry for the frustration of not answering some questions, but we'll get more chance.
All right.
Thank you, Cassie.
Thank you.
And kudos to the Lyra folks for making this happen so seamlessly. It looks easy, right? It's not.
Thanks, everybody. That was interesting.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
So anyone who wants to say can just leave the Zoom room open. This starts again at 12:30 for the next session. And if you want to go and have lunch or take advantage of the sunshine, we'll understand.
Oh yeah, it's sunny in Montreal.
Yes. How about in Ithaca?
Yeah, it's sunny, cool. Good driving weather. After the next session, my holiday starts.
Enjoy.
That's great. Hey, Ian and Sally, have you ever seen the work of Paul Edwards and Sandar, and his family name I've missed, on low pay in the UK?
Paul Edwards.
Paul Edwards, it will be
in the UK.
Yeah, I'll look for I think they did some things with and did a lot of interviews, qualitative work with low-paying employers and some of the dilemmas of low-paying employers and those who would like to pay more but feel they can't. So it would be really relevant to what you're doing. And I'm not sure whether it was in Work Employment Society or something else, but it shouldn't be hard to track down, and it's relevant to what you're doing.
Yeah, it might really inform some of the further questions too, because there's where we left off, there's a very interesting dialogue now going on in the working group between employers and workers and worker representatives about who really wants what and how hard is this, which is, I think, fascinating because it's misperceptions on both sides of what employers will or will not do, what's important to them. It turns out they're much more interested in fairness and morality than anybody thought. And then misperceptions on the worker side too, from employers about wage compression. Workers just aren't as concerned about wage compression as employers are.
And,
so
and you've got a fantastic example, and we have to talk in more detail of this question of wage compression because of the COVID crisis in healthcare facilities and notably long-term care facilities. Where they just were not able to get the people that they wanted in the jobs. So they therefore say, we have to increase it by $4 an hour. We have to increase it by $6 an hour. We have to improve conditions. Like it just was an illustration of why bad work doesn't work in that kind of facility. And then, for instance, in the retail grocery, they've just announced over the weekend now in Canada, at least, that they're dropping the COVID bonus of $4 an hour. Why? Because of wage compression that they don't want. And you have public sector negotiations going on here. And sorry to be too long, but just it beautifully illustrates all of these issues around compression and the problem of low pay.
Yeah, and I'm curious to see what's going to happen with, say, in retail where they're dropping the bonuses.